Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this week's webinar presentation. My name is Kathy Purdy. I'm the marketing manager here at Schoeneck King. Just two quick housekeeping items before we get started. Please enter your questions located at the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and we will address those as time allows throughout today's presentation. If you would take a moment to complete the brief survey once today's program has ended, we appreciate that. We do share your comments and suggestions for future topics with our presenters. So to start us off today, I'm going to hand it over to Andy Bobrek.
Thank you, Kathy. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be with you again this week. I hope you all had an enjoyable Memorial Day holiday weekend. I think it is important for us to note that we have on this webinar, I'm sure, many people who themselves currently serve or served in the past or who have a family member who served. That's certainly the case here at Schoeneck King with many current and former service members. And it's appropriate for us to perhaps them and offer a hearty thanks. And as an editorial, I think it's a great thing to live in a nation where we have people who from our community volunteer to come forward and serve their country and make sacrifices, and some making the ultimate sacrifice. So a good time for us to reflect on that too. So today we'll cover some of the usual topics that you will see. First up, we have a new face to our webinar and a relatively new face to Schoeneck King, but not a new face to the world of labor and employment law. Rebecca Kimura will be joining us today. Quietly, the EEOC on Friday published some new COVID-related guidance, updated some of its prior guidance dealing with vaccination. So we thought this is something that people would be interested in, and Rebecca's prepared an overview of this for everybody. So Rebecca, great to have you with us today.
Thanks, Andy, and good afternoon, everyone. This is my first weekly update webinar with Bond, and what better way to start off than discussing the EEOC. So as a refresher, you may recall that last December, the EEOC issued some guidance to employers on COVID-19 vaccination policies as employers were considering whether they should require their employees to be vaccinated to return to work. So taking into account the implications of vaccine requirements on the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA, and religious protections of Title VII, the EEOC in December didn't directly state that mandatory vaccination policies were lawful, but they did kind of suggest it by stating that if such a policy is adopted, then exemptions or accommodations would have to be made for employees with disabilities and those with religious objections and for pregnant workers. The EEOC also indicated that administering the COVID-19 vaccine is generally not a medical examination, and requiring an employee to show proof of vaccination is generally not a prohibited disability-related inquiry, although some follow-up questions, such as inquiring why somebody didn't get the vaccine, may be, and that would be subject to the ADA's standard that it be job-related and consistent with business necessity. Otherwise, the EEOC left many employers grappling with some unanswered questions. So last Friday, May 28th, the EEOC issued updated guidance for employers addressing frequently asked questions concerning vaccinations in the employment context. And there are four key areas that the update addresses. The first, on mandatory vaccination policies, the updated guidance affirms that employers can require that employees be vaccinated for COVID-19 as a condition to entering the workplace, provided that they comply with their obligations to explore reasonable accommodations for employees who can't be vaccinated due to disabilities or sincerely held religious beliefs. However, these EEOC cautions that employers may need to consider whether the mandatory vaccination policies have a disparate impact on certain protected classes, including those based on race and age and national origin. Also, employers may want to periodically assess their policy to determine if certain protected categories of employees are being disproportionately screened out. So that leads to the next question of how do you accommodate unvaccinated employees in the workplace? The updated guidance offers some suggestions as to what could be a reasonable accommodation for unvaccinated employees. And those include providing face masks, ensuring social distancing at work, offering a modified or staggered shift, periodically testing for COVID-19, permitting teleworking if possible, and exploring reassignment. The guidance further explains that if there's no accommodation that could be provided without imposing an undue hardship on the business, unvaccinated employees should not be excluded from the workplace until an assessment is conducted on each such person to determine whether that person poses a direct threat to the health and safety of that employee and to others in the workplace. And that's based on reasonable medical judgment that relies on the most current medical knowledge about COVID-19. So those determinations may change over time based on changing medical information. And as infection numbers continue to decline, the direct threat argument will begin to weaken. So for employers who are unsure how to deal with requests from employees who say they're unable to be vaccinated or who want to wait for an alternate version of the vaccine due to their sincerely held religious belief or practice, the EEOC recommends that employers should ordinarily assume that an employee's request for religious accommodation is based on a sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance. However, if an employer is aware of facts that would create an objective basis to question the religious nature or the sincerity of their sincerely held belief, then the employer can at that point request additional supporting information. As for employees who choose not to be vaccinated due to pregnancy, the guidance provides that employers may need to accommodate them as well, as they would with others who are similar in their ability or inability to work. Also, even fully vaccinated employees may be entitled to a reasonable accommodation if they have a continuing concern that they face a heightened risk of severe illness, and that would be those who are immunocompromised. Third, the guidance clarifies that information that an employee's COVID-19 vaccine status is considered confidential medical information under the ADA. So that means that while employers are allowed to request or require confirmation of vaccination from their employees, they have to keep that documentation or confirmation confidential, and they have to maintain it separately from the employee's personnel files. The fourth topic the updated guidance addresses is vaccine incentives for employees and their family members. The EEOC guidance confirms that employees may offer incentives to employees for receiving the vaccine if it's voluntary, and so long as the incentives are not so substantial that they're coercive. The reason behind that is that pre-vaccination disability-related screening questions are required, and so employees may feel pressured to disclose their protected medical information if the incentive is too big. In addition, employers may offer incentives to employees to provide documentation or other confirmation that they've been vaccinated, if they've been vaccinated from a third party, so not from the employer, such as from a pharmacy or a personal health care provider or a public clinic, and that would not violate the ADA or the GINA. And on the other hand, employees may not offer employee incentives for family members to be vaccinated, as that would violate GINA, because it would require the vaccinator to ask a family member pre-vaccination medical screening questions, which include medical questions about the family member. Otherwise, employers may provide employees and their family members with information to educate themselves about COVID vaccines and to raise awareness about the benefits of the vaccination. Finally, the updated guidance explains that if an employer requires employees to receive vaccinations administered by the employer or its agent, the ADA's restriction on making disability-related inquiries applies to pre-vaccinated screening questions. So the employers must demonstrate that the screening questions are job-related and consistent with business necessity. If, on the other hand, the employer offers to vaccinate employees on a voluntary basis, they don't need to meet that standard. So those are the updated guidances from the EEOC.
Great, Rebecca, thanks a lot. Appreciate that overview. If you haven't checked this out yet, viewers, I would encourage you to do so. We'll push out a link during the course of this so you can access that, print it out and keep it in your COVID folder for reference purposes. And I think you really covered the questions that were posed, Rebecca, throughout. So thank you for joining us. We hope you'll come back another time too and be with us. So next up, we continue to get a lot of questions about masks, of what to do with respect to employees who are have been vaccinated. Are they required to wear masks? What are the specific requirements for people who are unvaccinated? What rules are in place? So we invited Erin back again today to cover this topic and give you a little bit of background and try to answer some of the questions that we're continuing to see here. Erin, thanks.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for having me back. And I apologize for all of you that have had to now sit through what will be your third session of me talking about masks, but it continues to be a hot topic. And I'm very glad, Rebecca, that the EEOC did not completely do a 180 on what they did about 6 months ago, because it would have really impacted a lot of what we've been talking about with the mask mandates and asking people their vaccination status and proof of vaccine. So at least the EEOC didn't throw in too many wrenches when it comes to the issue of the mask mandate or unmandate or the unmasking. We need to come up with some fun term as to what's happening with the masks. But so the first thing I'd like to start with is just a few best practices that I've been observing over the course of the past couple weeks since the CDC and the state made the announcement that we can begin to allow our employees and our visitors, guests, customers to no longer wear masks where they have been fully vaccinated. And my first best practice here is, as a workplace, as an establishment, do not feel like pressured, like you have to make a quick decision on these issues. Continue to take your time to think about what you want your policy to look like, whether or not you want to have a separate policy for your employees versus customers or visitors. As I've said on here before, this is not a one-size-fits-all analysis in terms of what works best for each workplace. So again, continue to take your time and think about what you want your policy to be going forward as it applies to the mask mandate. And to that end, it is acceptable to reach out to your employees, to your staff, to talk to them about what they feel comfortable and to take, excuse the pun, people's temperature, not literally, but figuratively in this situation, about how they are feeling in the workplace without masks on. For those employers that are still remote, I know a number of my colleagues in the finance industry are just going to be returning to the office in the June, July, August timeframe. That's when their financial institution is requiring them to begin to go back. And so for those folks, they may not have stepped foot in the workplace for about 15, 18 months. So everyone may still have varying sensitivities to wearing a mask, being out in public with a mask or without a mask. And so, I would encourage you to speak to your employees either through a survey. Our firm did a survey to get our thoughts and opinions on mask requirements, and it is okay to do that. So I know we've gotten that question a number of times, and I want to make sure that I touch upon that and let everyone know that it's completely acceptable to speak to your employees, conduct a survey, whatever works for you about as you develop your mask policy. And then the next question, to require proof or no proof. The New York State's guidance that came out about a week and a half ago indicated that if you are a business that does not generally congregate employees in groups of 250 or more inside, then you do not have to require proof of vaccination, that you can go on what's called the honor system, where you just generally announce that if you're fully vaccinated, after having defined what that means, employees can no longer or can decide not to wear a mask. But if you want to require proof, you can do that as well. To Rebecca's point about the proof of vaccine being medical information, if you do require proof, just be sure that you give it the proper confidentiality that it requires. It is a medical record, so have it in a separate file with other medical information that you may have on your employees. Or if you are keeping a running list on any of your electronic databases, if it's a spreadsheet, a table, whatever it may be, just make sure that you have that information either password protected or encrypted, so that somebody can't just go into that document that's sitting on your document management system or on a server and access that information, just like you would any other piece of medical information. Another question that we have been getting asked quite often is, what if I have an employee that says to me, well, I don't have proof of vaccination. I haven't been vaccinated, but I had COVID 60 days ago, and therefore I'm immune. Do I have to wear a mask? And the answer to that is both the CDC guidance as well as New York State's guidance says that previous COVID infection does not define you or is not included within the definition of fully vaccinated, which means that that employee is not covered within the exemptions to the mask mandate. An employee has to be fully vaccinated, which means you had to have a Johnson & Johnson shot and you're out 2 weeks from that, or you had to have 2 Pfizer shots or 2 Moderna shots and you are 2 weeks out from your second shot. The definition does not include individuals who previously were infected with COVID. So if you get pushback from your employees who say, I was infected, I have immunity, unfortunately, the CDC and the state does not include them within the definition of fully vaccinated, and they would have to continue to wear a mask. As Katie has pointed out on this program previously, part of the unspoken policy underlying these changes in the mask mandate is to encourage people to get vaccinated. And so I think very purposefully, individuals who were previously infected with COVID are not included within the definition of fully vaccinated. I saw a story either late last week or over the weekend, I believe it was coming out of the CDC, that showed spikes in the number of people who got vaccinated following the White House's announcement that the CDC guidance was changing with regard to masking if you were fully vaccinated. So the policy, the policy that they were seeking, kind of case in point, there was a spike in individuals who were making their first appointments. So I would expect that the definition will continue as is, unless and until we get to a point where the state or federal government thinks that we are at a high enough vaccine rate that the mask mandate can go away altogether. But for right now, if an employee says they had COVID, it doesn't count. They still have to wear a mask. One of the other questions that we've gotten is, do I have to disclose during the hiring process whether or not we require masks for vaccinated or unvaccinated individuals? I don't think that there's anything that requires you to announce that, unless there is, Rebecca was just talking about mandatory vaccination. Unless you're an employer that is mandating vaccine as a condition of employment, I don't think that you have to announce your policy during the hiring process. Now, that being said, one of the best practices that I've been touching on and we'll talk about again is your policy should be clear, and you should be effectively communicating whatever policy you adopt to your employees, to your visitors, to your customers. That may include folks who you're trying to hire as well. So I don't think you have to announce it, but if you feel more comfortable announcing it because you think it would be helpful in recruiting, that's fine. You set expectations up from the get-go. To that point on this program before, I've identified that it's really important to clearly identify what your expectations are. Utilize signage to the extent you can that talks about expectations. I was out and about this weekend, and there were very few stores that have up what their expectation is. And just as a customer, I'm finding it very hard to navigate this process, this transition process that we're in. I just want to know what's expected of me, so that I wear my mask if that's what the place of business wants, or I don't have to, and somebody's not giving me the evil eye. But either way, I think it's really important for your guest experience, for your visitor experience, for your employees, that if you are a public place, a retailer, hotel, restaurant, make sure that what your expectations are clear, that there's signage indicating to your visitors, customers, staff, whatever it is, when they walk in, what you want to happen. Andy has said this before, and I completely agree. Most people just want to do the right thing with these types of situations. And so the more we communicate, the more we set expectations, people want to do the right thing. And then the last thing that I will touch upon is there was a question about whether or not we can train with regard to mask bias. I think it's really important that as you're rolling out your policy, you communicate to your employees as well as perhaps visitors on any signage that you put up, to respect people's choices to wear a mask. I've said before, we should not make a presumption about someone's vaccination status based on their if they continue to wear a mask in the workplace. Somebody may choose to wear a mask for many reasons having nothing to do with their vaccination status. So I would very much encourage that open dialogue and that conversation with your staff if you decide to adopt a policy that allows fully vaccinated employees to no longer wear masks. Because people have varying sensitivities at this point. Again, we're all transitioning back into the physical workspace, trying to navigate this transition time. So we should all be respectful of each other's decisions, and it's very important to communicate that. And with that, Andy, I will turn it back to you.
Erin, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. I know our audience does too. One, I'm just curious what you're seeing out in Western New York. So since the new mask guidance came out, I've been here in Central New York. I've been down in the Hudson Valley for work, and then in the Southern Tier. And at least in retail type spots, I'm seeing, and I agree with you 100%. Like the first thing I'm doing is looking at the door. And of course, there's like 10 signs on every door now, right, that you go to in the public. So I got to find the right sign. Eventually, most of them I've been able to find, and they seem to be operating on the honor system. Are you seeing that similarly in Western New York?
Yeah, so I was out and about this weekend. I was at a mall and some other standalone shops. I will say that what I was seeing at the mall, where there's a lot of stores, is that it was generally recommended that you wear one, but each store could set their own policy. I did not see any particular store with anything different than what the general mall guidance was. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of it, and I have not seen anybody asking for proof of vaccine at any retail establishment in this area. Yeah. It's been mostly either mask wearing is recommended, but not required for fully vaccinated individuals. But I haven't seen anybody asking for proof of vaccine at this point. I think most have decided that is not something that they either can undertake because they just don't have the staff to do so. And yeah, I would not want to be the person having to ask for proof of vaccine at any door. So
fair enough. I'm curious. One of the great things with our reach across the entire state, including down in New York City and the Albany areas, we have colleagues, and they're here today. So, Katie, just quickly, are you seeing similar kind of the honor system in Albany for the most part?
Honor system, I mean, that would require that I went somewhere the past weekend in Albany. Instead, I went wine tasting in the Finger Lakes, where we did have to have our vaccine status checked at a winery. And my dad was very proud to be able to pull out his Excelsior pass and use it for the first time. So that was really thrilling for him.
Got it. Rebecca, how about you down in the city? Are you seeing honor system prevalent there?
I actually did go out this weekend shopping downtown, and
Yeah.
all the stores required you still to wear the mask because I think they don't want to check and they don't want to have to get in that trouble, so they just require it.
Interesting to see the dynamic there across the state. Great, thank you for that. And I'll talk a little bit more in my section about the honor system too in just a minute. Erin, thanks a lot. I'm not going to completely let you off the hook on masks. Maybe we'll invite you back to talk about something else.
One more time. All right.
Yeah, we'll see. Thanks.
Thanks, Andy.
All right, Katie Anderson is up next. I know she's got a lot to talk about in terms of the legislative session coming to a close here. Katie, how are you? What's going on?
All right. I mean, I'm great. I love a 3-day weekend. So I'm doing great today, Andy. Thanks for asking. And yeah, let's go through what's happening in Albany. So first, starting with some of my favorite numbers that we've seen in a while. This weekend, New York State reported the lowest positivity rates that we've had since the end of August. It's excellent news. We continue to see cases really decline rapidly in the state and throughout the state. Some counties like Columbia County, which is right down the road from here, is reporting 1 case a day. So it's really, that's great news to see that going on in the state. And we are still making progress with vaccinations. Over the past week, we have seen, every week since we opened up the eligibility to everyone, we've seen the number of people receiving the vaccine decrease, but there's still a significant number of people who are receiving the vaccine. In New York City right now, in subway stations, they are just offering the vaccine to people. You can just walk right up, get the shot. And approximately 11,000 people have done that in the past month or so that program has been operating, which is great news. Looking at the numbers, so all New Yorkers, we've got 46% of all New Yorkers are fully vaccinated, and you have 55% that have received at least 1 dose. Now that's everyone. But when you're looking at 18 and older, you have 65% of New Yorkers have taken the first dose. That's incredible to hear. That shows that we're really marching on the right path in terms of vaccines. So for 12 to 15-year-olds, which their eligibility has only recently opened up, 20% of them have taken the first dose. And to encourage that demographic, 12 to 17-year-olds, to receive the vaccine, the state is offering 10 full room and board scholarships to any SUNY or CUNY school. They will be raffling this off over the next 5 weeks. So, if you've got anybody who's hasn't gotten their vaccine yet and at some point may want to go to college, if I had that option, I would have taken it for sure. So let's look at the legislative session. I come on here a lot. I talk a lot about what updates are coming from Albany in terms of COVID. Past week, there weren't a lot of COVID updates, but guess what? It's the end of the legislative session, so there's always a ton of legislative updates. I could have, for the past year, gone on here and just talked about what the legislature was doing, but I haven't because we've had more pressing issues. Now we're turning to what are they doing? So their last scheduled day of session is June 10th. That is about 2 weeks earlier than it used to be because the primary elections in New York are on June 22nd, I believe. It's that Tuesday in June. So they pushed the end of session earlier so that people who are running for office can go and campaign. Looking at the pace of bills that have passed this year, it's really quite astonishing how few have passed compared to other years. So in 2019, which I would say is our last benchmark year to look at in terms of the legislative session was in person, there were 935 bills that passed. They passed, and that was a banner year for legislation. Usually they're passing around 700 to 800 bills a year. This year, we have 258 bills that have passed. That is, there's no way they're going to get to that number, to 700 or 800 in the next week. It's just not going to happen. I wouldn't be surprised if they get to 400 maybe, but, so far it's been slow how they've been moving. And the legislature does remain remote. That has been, there are good news and bad news with all of that, right? The good news is many of legislators and their staff have remained in their districts. They've been able to focus more on what their districts need. I know that almost every single legislator's office has one person whose entire job is to help people get their benefits for unemployment. Because it's been such a mess over the past year. So they are likely going to remain remote for the next 10 days. I would be astonished if they came back in. But remote session means they haven't gotten as much done. They aren't meeting, they're not having the same type of dialogue. You're not running into the people in the hallway. It's a very fast-paced environment that you really need to have that FaceTime. So they haven't. And the other wrench that could be thrown in this in the next 10 days is if the attorney general's report into the governor comes out in the next 10 days. I don't think it's going to come out in the next 10 days. It looks like they are really deep in the thick of that investigation. So we would probably be looking for the summer for an update on that investigation. But these are the bills that I went through are some of the bills that are the biggest bills at the moment and where they're going to be for the rest of the year. So the HERO Act, which has been on the minds of many of you, I know, we've got that June 4th deadline coming right up. The HERO Act chapter amendment passed the Senate last week. It is currently in a committee, on a committee agenda in the Assembly. They will likely move it out of that committee tomorrow, and they will likely be passing it or trying to pass it this week. So stay tuned on that. I know it's really, they're creating a nail biter for us. But we will let you know what's happening there. The Privacy Act, which is New York's mini GDPR, which is the European Union's privacy law that is enormous. That bill has really stalled. It has a lot of opposition from the Internet Association. So internet groups like Facebook, Google, they really oppose this legislation. So that doesn't look like it's going to go anywhere. The Adult Survivors Act, it has stalled in the Assembly. It's getting a lot of push right now. This, like the Child Victims Act, would create a one-year look-back window where adults could sue for sexual assault that occurred when they were over 18. It stalled, but there is a good chance that it will be picked up again in the next 10 days. So keep our eyes out for that one. The Gig Worker Collective Bargaining Bill. This is the bill that would give certain rights to, app-based workers. So you have your Uber drivers, your DoorDash. That bill is stalled. It doesn't meet the needs that progressives want it to meet. So it is likely not going anywhere for the rest of the session. The Climate and Community Investment Act, this act would notably, it would do a lot of things. It would create lots of funds to combat climate change. One thing it would do, though, is raise gas taxes on individuals by a significant amount. It would likely work out to be around 50 cents per gallon, which that has met fierce opposition. And that bill is not, it's probably not going anywhere for the rest of this year until they remove that provision, especially. Lead in schools, there was a deal made last week with legislators. This bill will likely move. This bill lowers the acceptable threshold level of lead in water at schools, and it requires mandatory testing of school water every 3 years. Schools will be reimbursed for any remediation that they have to do by the Department of Environmental Conservation. And finally, we have 2 open seats in the New York State Court of Appeals right now. The New York State Court of Appeals is New York's highest court. It's confusing how New York's court system is named, but this does matter greatly to New Yorkers. This is New York's version of the US Supreme Court, and we have 2 open seats at the moment. The governor has nominated 2 people, and like you see with the federal government, the Senate will have to confirm those individuals. It's likely that they will. We don't really see any reason that they wouldn't at this point. So with that, Andy, that is another update from Albany.
All right, you can take a deep breath now.
I know,
Katie.
it was a lot.
Thank you.
That was a refined list.
I know. No, I know. It was pared down. Yes.
So I started with a lot more.
Yep. There. All right. Well, thank you again, everybody. So we got a little bit of time left here. I'm going to try to incorporate a new segment to the webinar when I'm hosting. We'll call it the email bag here. We appreciate the emails or the chat posts that you send to us every week. The reality is there's so many of them, we can't answer them all during our webinar, but we do look at them every week. Please keep your questions coming. They help us in understanding the type of content that you're looking for, and we of course want to be responsive. But so I picked a few to just touch on very briefly today on this, and these are questions that we're continuing to get here. So there was a bit of confusion going back just a matter of days, where the governor issued a press release or made comments to the press that said, hey, if you're not feeling well after you get your COVID vaccination, there's a state mandated paid leave provided for you, without really explaining what that would be, and having some people think that it perhaps meant a new additional bucket of leave that HR needed to keep track of and that employers needed to provide to employees in the private sector. The state, however, subsequently issued guidance that made clear what the governor was talking about in that situation. And again, it's something I think that was put out to try to motivate more people to seek vaccination and not worry about side effects, at least missing work because of side effects. But what the state did is just issue guidance and said, hey, if you are eligible for paid sick leave under the law and under your employer's policy, you can use that paid sick leave time for side effects that you may experience if you can't work after you get a vaccination. And this is something that we had discussed internally as a firm that we anticipated would be the case. The scope of conditions that are covered by the paid sick leave are so broad, they don't require a diagnosis, they don't require medical intervention, that certainly that would cover a situation where someone is experiencing side effects and has to miss work following vaccination. I don't read, and I think others would agree with this, I don't read this guidance as requiring employers to create an additional bucket or to provide additional paid sick leave beyond what is already provided under the statute. So in other words, if I have an employee who has exhausted her full bank of 56 hours of PSL and then is subsequently out because of experiencing side effects due to the COVID vaccination, well, then we're left to whatever our policies and terms are. We would not necessarily have to provide an additional amount of PSL time for that employee. So hopefully that helps clarify that issue there. We put out communication to clients and friends of the firm last week explaining that too. All right, so the number one question I continue to get asked is, what about the HERO Act templates? When are we going to see the state's guidance on this? As Katie mentioned to you, there were amendments that were proposed and negotiated to the HERO Act legislation. Those are working their way through the legislative process currently. We do expect those to follow through that process and to be enacted. And if that happens, that would extend the effective date of the legislation from June 4th to July 4th. And that would also lengthen the period of time that we would have as employers to first adopt our plan and then publish it and disseminate it to employees. We're looking at that window is going to be end of summer. I think or August timeframe on when we're looking to have that need to have that all in place. And if that effective date gets extended as we expect it to until July 4th, well, I think that's likely when we're going to see those templates published. If history is any indicator, it's usually at the 11th hour and 59th minute when the guidance comes out that we need to rely on. And so I think that will probably be the case here. Stay tuned on that. You can absolutely expect that we will report on that when that happens, and we will push that out through our social media outlets as well as to our client updates. Second best top question that I get is, hey, do we still have to do the COVID screening for our employees, even those who we have proof that they've been vaccinated? I went and double checked the guidance documents that the state put out as part of the New York reopening plan, which you'll remember have been modified from time to time. those still do require the screening. I appreciate that this may not make practical sense, but there are still concerns about vaccinated people potentially being symptomatic and spreading this. So we have not seen them pull back on those screening requirements. You do need to continue to perform those if required under your particular plan and industry specific guidance. Another question we'll get frequently is, well, how do certain people, not everyone may know if someone's vaccinated or not. And from an enforcement standpoint, how can we be assured that this person who may not be wearing a mask is indeed vaccinated? And let's say maybe you're operating on the honor system in that case. Either way, whether you're seeking documentation or operating on the honor system, the question arises, can we have there be some type of insignia that the individual wears to denote that they have been vaccinated? This is a question that I think I would recommend. I think the short answer could be yes. There could be some insignia that your employee could display, but it's something you're going to want to work with your HR professional team as well as legal counsel just to identify any issues and make sure that you get the best guidance for your organization or business. Also, we get questions a lot. Well, what about OSHA? We're concerned about our general duty clause. We're concerned about OSHA's general duty clause and our obligation to provide a safe workplace. And are we perhaps creating an issue or concern by allowing employees to not wear masks at work? It's a good question. It's something good to be thinking about too. And there has been some guidance that OSHA put out previously that suggested and indicated we shouldn't treat vaccinated and unvaccinated employees differently. If you go to OSHA's website now, and I pushed out a link to a number of guidance documents that I'll reference here, including OSHA's latest guidance on COVID-related issues that you can check out. In that guidance, you'll see that OSHA very specifically points to the CDC and the CDC's updated guidance on mask wearing for vaccinated employees. So again, while things can certainly change and pivot, what I'm seeing right now from OSHA is deference to CDC and its guidance, and OSHA just not having caught up as of yet with the administrative guidance that they've got out. But they've put placeholder disclaimers on their guidance referencing the CDC's updated mask wearing guidance and vaccine related guidance and indicating a deference that they'll pay to CDC's input on these issues. So again, note that there. I checked earlier this morning. I have not seen anything on OSHA's emergency temporary standard on COVID. Last I knew, it was submitted to the Office of Management and Budget for review as part of the normal regulatory process, but we haven't seen any action there. It raises a question in my mind as to whether we really will see any action there in a standard coming out. Certainly, there was a strong push from the Biden administration at the outset for such a standard, but we haven't quite seen that same impetus demonstrated in more recent weeks as COVID cases continue to decline and we see this reopening and lessening of requirements. Whether there's a correlation there, I can't tell you, but stay tuned. We will continue to monitor that. Our capacity limitations still in place? Well, the short answer there is yes, they can be. Again, it's going to depend on your particular industry and circumstances. You're going to want to review the relevant state guidance. There's no magic one-size-fits-all answer to that question. Again, it's going to depend on the nature of your business and organization and the guidance that the state has put out. Certainly, we can work with you and help if you have any questions on those issues. And finally, international travel. As summer months are here, the world is starting to open up and people are starting to travel internationally. This is a question that we're getting. How do we handle this? This is an area that I think there hasn't been as much outreach, but there has been some pretty drastic changes, both from what the federal government and the CDC has published by way of guidance and what New York State has put out. I sent you links to both the CDC's guidance on international travel, as well as to New York's guidance on travel. And on the next two slides, you'll see excerpts from this guidance too. The first slide that you'll see here is the CDC's international guidance. I thought this was a pretty handy reference. So as it stands right now, for international travel, and again, the CDC issues guidance. right? They're not issuing per se requirements, but we look at these, we look at these very closely. And of course, the point is well made that generally speaking, we should follow closely what CDC is recommending, given their expertise in these areas. But you'll see here the treatment of individuals who are vaccinated or fully vaccinated. And I offer this just for your reference. But I think the operative principles are, even if I'm vaccinated, I need to wear a mask when I'm overseas traveling. So if I'm on an overseas plane or bus, I need to mask up during those periods. I need to get a test before I return to the States and have that be negative within a certain time frame. And then there's a recommendation that I receive testing when I return. As you'll see on the next slide, New York's guidance on international travel largely adopts the CDC's recommendations. Again, this is information I pulled right from their website this morning, so you'll have it there as well. Right now, there is no per se quarantine requirement for someone who's asymptomatic and returning from an international travel. I think that's a key change to be mindful of here. Again, as long as they're asymptomatic. If they're symptomatic, of course, that's an entirely different issue. And then you see the divergence in terms of if you're vaccinated and if you're not vaccinated. But even those people who are vaccinated will need to test before they return to New York. All right, I think that's what we wanted to cover today. We thank you all very much for joining us. If you have questions on these particular topics, please feel free to email the attorneys who presented here. I thank you again, everyone, for presenting. And there's a link here as well to Bond's Labor and Employment Treatise. If you'd like to have a copy of that, you can link here either to the Bar Association in New York if you're a member or through Amazon. Thanks, everybody. We'll be back in touch with you next week. Take care.